people walking past here on the street. So yeah.
This happens. Yeah. There may be some noises in the background here too. Eventually,
Yeah.
It shouldn't matter too much.
We can overpower them with our own charisma.
Indeed. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you first, and then we can get into our discussion because we're going to be using this in our event, of course. Okay, let me get started then. Our expert guest for this event is Dr. Anders Sandberg, who also happens to be a longtime friend going back at least to 2007 and the first whole brain emulation workshop that was organized by the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, possibly even further than that. Dr. Sandberg did his PhD work in computational neuroscience, which means we could geek out about that at length if this were a private fireside chat. Anders is a senior research fellow of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, and of course he's highly respected in fields of philosophy that deal with existential risk, the impact of future technologies, and artificial intelligence and whole brain emulation. He's also an excellent speaker and debater, and as always, I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you. Welcome, Anders. Thanks for agreeing to do this interview and to try to join in on the Q&A on the day of the event, even though you'll still be returning from travel that day. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Randal. This is exciting. It's fun to be not quite here, but communicating.
Right, yeah. So you're of course familiar with the goals of the Carbon Copies Foundation, and I imagine that it's okay. I imagine that you can also see that people who are working on whole brain emulation and people at the Carbon Copies Foundation are also really interested in artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. Now, we don't very often talk about that in our workshops because there are already so many groups out there that are doing that. But we did feel that the overlap and the interactions or possible interactions between work towards whole brain emulation and work on artificial intelligence is something that hasn't really received sufficient attention yet. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your thoughts on AI and about risks and benefits and about this area of interaction. Is that good?
That sounds excellent.
Okay. So you've got a long history of dedicated concern and supporting some serious study on existential risk and in particular AI risk and AI safety. Could you tell us a little bit about how your thoughts have evolved in that time since you got started?
So I vividly remember being on a train ride to Yale University back in the early 2000s, reading Nick Bostrom's recently published paper on existential risk. And I had this knee-jerk reaction. This is preposterous. This is so stupid. This is just going to be used to slow down science, and we need more science and technology more rapidly. And then gradually I became aware that actually that knee-jerk reaction might be a little bit too naive. Gradually I warmed to the idea that actually existential risk is a pretty dominant concern. Not the only super important concern, but certainly it matters a lot. But the problem is, of course, just being concerned is not enough. You need to start picking apart the probabilities and risks and uncertainties to try to see where can we do the most. There are some risks that we simply cannot budge. Supervolcanoes for the moment, for example, there is a finite risk that we all die of natural causes. There is no point in worrying too much about them. The other risks that are relatively intractable, but many people are also working on them, like nuclear war risk. And then there are those risks that are more tractable. And at this point it gets interesting. If they're neglected but tractable, then you should probably put in more effort, especially since even a small amount of effort, if it's a very tractable risk, can help a lot. So to me, future technologies are interesting because they have a fair bit of tractability simply because we're making up these technologies as we go along. We're inventing and discovering things. And that means that we can also regulate them and safeguard them in various ways. If we're careful, if we make the right choices, which is not always possible.
And besides artificial intelligence and related areas, are there other examples that you would say are areas where we could put in more of an effort than we're doing today? You know, maybe not supervolcanoes or something like that, but other areas?
I think biorisks are a good example. So there's certainly a fair bit of people working on pandemics and biosecurity, but many of the emerging biotechnologies probably pose entirely new kinds of risk. And I think it would be a good idea to make a serious inventory of what we might find there and trying to preclude some of those risks. And that might require various forms of disease surveillance and innovative methods of actually stopping, for example, gene drives, etc. And I think this might be true for other technologies. One good example is actually quantum computers, which are not an existential risk, but a risk for encryption and privacy. The solution is, of course, quantum safe encryption, which both NSA and Google are trying to develop. And then we need to promulgate it before the quantum computers become too good. We want to have it around for so long that our secrets are kind of safe, because the ones that can be cracked by the quantum computers, well, they're meh by this point.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was just out at South by Southwest, and there was a startup company presenting there. Unfortunately, I didn't catch their talk, and I don't remember their name, but they were explicitly saying that they offer quantum encryption as a way to safeguard your data. Even now, I don't know how they're doing it, but they're out there.
So one interesting thing is that you can, of course, encrypt data using quantum encryption over a communications line. And it's not as easy as people thought, but especially the Chinese have been working very assiduously on developing this. But then you also want to have a quantum safe encryption method, and that might actually not involve any magical quantum computing. But it might be good for your branding if there's quantum in the name anyway. But I think this is going to become more and more urgent.
It's interesting that that we're going down this path right now, because that's a great segue into something I wanted to talk about, where Dr. Ben Goertzel is concerned. He's a mutual friend of ours and a researcher in artificial general intelligence. And he sees things a little bit differently than, for example, Nick Bostrom does or Eliezer Yudkowsky does. He wrote a paper in 2005, so it's a few years old now, and the paper was called Superintelligence, Fears, Promises, and Potentials. And it seems one of the things that he explicitly talks about is that the probability of different risks isn't addressed very well, and it's very hard for us to judge which risk is really the one that we should be paying attention to the most. And then, for example, is it a case where other risks are so great that the potential benefit of artificial general intelligence in helping us prevent those risks that might be on balance more important than, say, worrying too much about the existential risk of AGI itself. So I think you're probably familiar with his thoughts on that, and I was wondering how you would balance those approaches.
So that argument is a bit similar to an argument I heard for trying to send messages to extraterrestrial intelligence. Again, we are under so much risk here, so even though maybe there is some risk of getting unfriendly aliens on the phone, if we get friendly aliens, that might actually save us. Now, if one is really desperate, I think that kind of Hail Mary strategy really might make sense. But I don't think we're necessarily that desperate yet. We got some years until we get artificial general intelligence, maybe quite a lot of years, and we actually have a decent track record of surviving so far, which might, of course, not indicate that risks are small, but at least that we can do something about it. So I do think that we should do this judgment, but there is quite a lot of things we can do about that. So, for example, demonstrating that on the net AGI is going to be better than no AGI. Well, I think that is fairly doable. On the other hand, showing that safe AGI is much easier than dangerous AGI, I think that is going to be tough to demonstrate. I think you are not going to be able to prove that with any rigor.
Okay, but it is still kind of hand-wavy, isn't it? Because you said, for instance, that you don't think we're very desperate in terms of any of those other riscs, but are we desperate in terms of the risk of dangerous AGI, right? That's the same question.
Well, the thing about right now, when we look at the existential risk to humanity, I think nuclear war still is in the top. And you can even make a Bayesian estimation of naively. We have seen, 73 years of no nuclear war. So if you apply a beta function, etc., you end up with between 0.1 and 1% risk per year, which is disconcerting. Maybe a nuclear war is not an existential risk, but it's still a certain amount of probability that is kind of worrisome. Now, budging that nuclear war risk is important work, but it's also it takes a lot of effort. You want a lot of diplomats, you want a lot of people in peace studies to do their job. Now, AI risk is relatively mobile right now because we're still at a very early stage. A few insights might actually change the risk profile quite a bit. So what I'm arguing is not so much that we know that unfriendly AI is super likely. I know some people who actually think this should be regarded as the default position. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. They might be right, they might not be right. But I can certainly see that by moving kind of AI safety research earlier in time, we can reduce the risk and probably do quite a bit of useful risk reduction that way.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, yeah. I mean, if we simply ignored that there was any risk at all and didn't have any people interested in AI safety, that would definitely open up, I guess, a bigger potential for the worst case scenarios. I'm sort of curious about both of those things. Actually, the worst case scenario and what to do about it, because now we've spoken very abstractly about the risk from AI, and we've also spoken in a very abstract sense about, well, we should do something about that. And I'm kind of curious, what do you think is the worst case scenario that should be expected if, say, an unfriendly AGI is developed, and what do you think is the best way to try to prevent this? So if we do have people interested in AI safety, which route do you think is the most promising?
I do think, because I think most scenarios we can imagine, we can start imagining ways around, and I think we could actually have at least some chance of reducing the impact. So I would expect the worst case scenario to be very bad and totally not look at anything I could formulate. So you could imagine a scenario like, well, actually, rapidly and self-enhanced intelligence is possible. So there are some systems that generate that, so you get a fairly hard takeoff with some random utility function, and then it goes off and does something random, but instrumentally very, very competent. So it does everything it needs to prevent us from ever being able to stop it. So now basically you're in the same universe as a force that you cannot by definition stop, and is going to do something that's likely very dramatic. Whether that is taking apart Earth to use the atoms or doing something else, very hard to say. Now, I think it's very likely that we're going to run into other bad AI problems long before this. So in many ways, the worst possible scenario is that AI works really well, and then we improve on it and it works really well, and it all keeps on going super well until it suddenly just turns super bad. On the other hand, I think it's more realistic to assume that we develop AI, we do stupid mistakes, bad things happen. We fix those. We keep on doing things. We discover new problems. This keeps on iterating and happening. And in the nice scenario, we robustly figure out ways of actually controlling the AI, setting up motivations, and other kinds of safeguards we currently don't understand before we get to the truly dangerous territory. The more scary scenario is, of course, the one where we don't learn anything, but we create incentives to use it. So companies that don't use AI to direct their activity are going to be doing badly on the stock market. So everybody will be using them, and then these systems get more and more powerful, and the world gets crazier and crazier. But if you don't use AI, the craziness crushes you. And then you end up in a world that is not suited for humans, yet nobody has won very much. Now, the ideal scenario is, of course, that we figure out useful things early on and fix that. And in the best of all possible world, maybe there's some simple mathematical theorem that you can prove that gives you a safe AI. And it's also politically very easy to convince everybody that we should be implementing this everywhere. In a more plausible world, it's going to probably be a whole little science of safety, just like we have safety in a lot of other domains. And this is going to be fairly messy. Just think about computer security, and think about how we're failing at computer security today because the incentives are all wrong. The software companies are not held liable for the insecurity of products, yet we buy them. And the end result is that we have built an entire infrastructure on systems that we can't fully trust, that in fact have enormous glaring security holes. We kind of all know that, and we all choose to ignore it because living without a modern smartphone is not practical.
Yeah. Motivations and having holding people accountable, holding companies accountable is really important. Yeah, so I like that you went into this, what is a more plausible scenario, and sort of looked at all these, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to really predict anything because it's so many different routes that are possible. It's very complex to look into the future. But it's, that takes us a little bit away from just focusing on, uh, you know, something, assuming that the major AGI or AI out there is always going to be something that has a fixed utility function and maximizes that utility function, that's where the danger comes from, whereas the reality might be more messy than that, which I think is also something that Ben touched on in his paper.
And I do think this shows the importance of trying different approaches to AI safety. So while our friends at MIRI are taking a fairly axiomatic approach and are thinking in terms of very fixed structures, around the FHI we have some people who are working very much on learning systems. And I'm hoping in the future we're going to see even more approaches, because right now we fully don't understand what the domain is, and we might actually want to combine different approaches or figure out what are the subtle problems with them. And this even includes the people who are working on near-term AI safety. Quite a lot of them are, of course, not terribly fond of talking about AGI and superintelligence. They think that they have enough trouble with their autonomous cars or how to manage drones well, or even getting out the bias of the credit scoring systems. But I do think there is actually a continuum here from very near-term issues about controlling complex adaptive technological systems to the long-term issues. When these systems become essentially autonomous and super powerful, how do we ensure that we already have enough of what counts as the important part of control?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we could talk about this forever, basically, because, every single thing that we say brings up another question. So when we say, timelines, how long-term problems versus near-term problems, how long is long-term, all that sort of thing. But, I'm going to try to steer this towards the whole brain emulation topic. So when I discuss whole brain emulation in the context of AI, when I talk to someone about that, then I typically get two very different kinds of reactions. Some people will give me the reaction where they say, I think that whole brain emulation is an important potential safeguard against, humanity suffering the worst case scenario from, runaway AGI. And others will say, well, that may be true, that there's something to be found in terms of long-term future benefit for humanity, but at the same time, working on whole brain emulation carries its risks in terms of either whole brain emulation itself being a risk, or whole brain emulation somehow accelerating the development of potentially dangerous AI. So I'd like to start talking about that and ask you a few questions about it. Now, I've already talked with Jan Lin. He gave an interview as well, which is being presented in the same event. And he was cautiously optimistic. He felt that whole brain emulation research would probably end up being a net positive in terms of existential risk. And he said that he was basing his opinion largely on what he learned from Carl Schulman, who's also at the FHI, isn't he? Yeah, and so clearly we should probably reach out to Carl in our follow-up to this event. But I was wondering, because he mentioned that, what do you think about the level of study that's been done so far on this particular problem of the interaction between AI safety and research on whole brain emulation? And do you think there are specific people who are the leading thinkers in that sort of overlap area that we should be talking to?
Right now, I don't think there have been enough study of this. There have been informal arguments, and in many cases, these informal arguments go back and forth, and a bit based on personal taste. Maybe one has invested a lot of effort in brain emulation, then that is automatically going to bias you towards thinking this is probably pretty safe. I think the core question is how much would progress in neuroscience push AGI and vice versa? So one possible argument would be if we do brain emulation, it's not just that we by definition will have a lot of computing power, but we will also have good ways of scanning brains. That directly doesn't help AGI much, but also a good way of modeling and running these scanned neural tissues. And that's going to, long before we get to a human level, give us quite a lot of access to interesting neural algorithms. So maybe neuroscientists will discover useful things. they will rush off and tell their friends, the AI researchers, who immediately implement these algorithms, and now suddenly AI moves forward a lot. This story has one big problem. How quickly do neuroscientists figure out things by having actually a really good neural model to study? And how quickly do they tell the AI researchers who can actually make use of it? So I think empirically the answer seems to be that it actually takes a fair bit of time before neuroscientists understand neural issues, even if they have good simulations, because it's very complicated and we're not terribly good at figuring it out. As a former computational neuroscientist, I'm kind of embarrassed by how little progress we've been making, despite our models becoming much bigger. But the reason is, of course, we need better ways of understanding. Now, brain emulation is not necessarily based on having a super profound understanding of high-level stuff that would drive AGI. But the most of the scientific interest is going to be about that rather than achieving brain emulation. And even when neuroscientists have found something interesting, like how the reinforcement learning systems of the brain works, or some of the neural representations, it seems to take a fairly long while before the AI researchers pick it up. So if you take, for example, Russell and Norwig's book on AI, and leaf through the chapter about the history of a field and insights that have driven it, you find a long list of interesting neuroscience insights. And then you try to check how many decades it was between people figure it out and it became a part of an AI project. And quite often it's several decades. So if things stay the same, I wouldn't be too worried, because we might be doing the brain emulations and then a few decades later the neuroscientist gets the memo. However, that might change in the future. It might turn out that maybe AI research and neuroscience meld together much more. It might be that actually people like Google DeepMind, who started by people coming from Peter Diane's group in neuroscience, have learned how to read neuroscience paper and actually get useful ideas from it. Or it might favorite example might be that maybe the way the cortex organizes information and does online learning, that is really a simple thing once you understand it, and then you can apply it in AI. I don't know how to assign much credence to this, but I think it's worth investigating much more deeply. We probably need to develop tools to do that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. You covered a lot of ground there. And yeah, this sort of echoes my thinking about it as well. I do think that there are definitely things that we can still learn from the way the brain works compared to how AI works. Say, for instance, how do you manage to learn a large variety of things in various contexts and do so from very few examples compared to what, say, you pump into a deep learning network these days. Those are the sorts of things where, there's still a lot that we can learn. But it's not entirely obvious how you discover that in the brain. And as you said, so it's not clear how fast can neuroscientists convert that into something AI could use. And for instance, this is a point where Jan mentioned, well, he thought that AI could probably search the space of probable models and probable methods better and faster than, say, neuroscientists would be able to interpret what's going on in the brain. So if you need to solve some issue with reinforcement learning or something like that, it would probably be faster to improve that just pure AI development. I'm not sure that's true because, some problems explode very quickly. Numbers are big very fast. And then when you say we're going to explore all possible models or something like that, if you don't have a good strategy, you could be stuck until the end of the universe. So that's not, yeah.
One of the really interesting things, though, is that hyperparameter searches in machine learning have become much better recently. People had some useful insights and found machine learning methods to improve other machine learning methods. And I think we should expect at least that to continue. That's not necessarily searching this enormously large landscape. It's just maybe 10 or 20 dimensions of hyperparameters, but that's already a pretty high dimensional space. So it might be useful to just keep an eye on this and how good does this generalize to other domains, including trying to find models in other domains. If you start seeing the automatic model making to really take off, then we should expect things to get rather explosive.
Indeed, yeah. But that's also where it becomes much more complex than just predicting a system that will, use a simple algorithm to improve its utility function maximization over time, because if you're building completely different modules that work in a different way, then you have different algorithms and everything becomes a lot more unpredictable.
At
So in
least
terms of
for
AI
a
safety,
normal human perspective, it might turn out that there might be tools to do this too. So I think Eric Drexler has made a very good point in his big report about reframing a bit of AI safety. We quite often think about the AI or the neural network as somewhat self-contained systems, but actually the part of a practice of generating things that solve various problems. And most people in business anyway don't care about AGI, they just want to solve some practical problem. So we're developing pipelines and services that generate these things. Again, that is worth watching, especially since when they can be applied to brain emulation, then we might get a pipeline towards better brain emulation. When we get a pipeline for decoding neural tissue and figuring out things about it, then we should expect that to at least boost neuroscience.
indeed, yeah. And what we really should be talking about is an ecosystem of various AI instead of the single AI that's going somewhere. Yeah, indeed. So now maybe we can run through a few very specific points that get brought up, because these are just things where, uh, you know, where I often get an opinion from someone or a statement, but there isn't necessarily that much material behind it, and I wonder if maybe there's a way to slowly push towards a more precise understanding of those particular concerns or questions. So the first one I'd like to get into is the the idea of having a brain-computer interface, a high-bandwidth brain-computer interface, something that is the target of research and also of some for-profit companies. I'm not going to go mentioning names, but we probably know who they are. And you get sometimes you hear from them statements such as, "If only if we can have a high-bandwidth connection between the human brain and a machine, then first of all, that will help us avoid AI safety problems because somehow we'll be more tightly connected with that. There'll be some symbiotic relationship between us. And secondly, we'll be able to benefit very strongly from, from this connection, and we'll be sort of a part of that advancement." Have you thought about this claim regarding to now brain-computer interfaces? We're not yet talking about neural prosthesis in this case.
Yeah, so I vividly remember a few years back when Elon Musk had spouted off something. It was general face palming around the office. We like Elon, but many people thought, oh, that sounded stupid. And I have a big mouth. I said, maybe there is something to the argument. So then my manager gave me 2 weeks to try to make a steelman version of argument. That's the opposite of strawman. Let's see if one can make this argument work. And I found that the first version of the argument that's saying, if we get brain-computer interfaces, we're going to get enhanced, and then we're going to be smarter than the AI. That seems pretty unlikely. There are real problems in making an enhancement that makes you super intelligent, especially if you need to do that within a relatively short time frame. We might not know how far it is until you get super intelligent AI, but the time it takes to test out anything that deals with human biology, anything that's medical, and then try to develop user interfaces and enhancements, that seems to be something that potentially could take quite a long time. There is another argument, and that is, if you can't beat them, join them. So I get my brain-computer interface, I'm linked to the AIs, and this way I'm going to be on the winning side. Except, of course, that the nature of that link and what we mean by winning side is quite tricky. By some accounts, my mind is already linked to my cell phone because of the extended mind hypothesis. Part of my mind resides in my calendar and other applications. I don't have certain memories in my head, they're in my smartphone. So maybe I'm already linked to machines. And now if the dangerous paperclip AI takes over the world and turns it all into paperclips, in some sense I was on the winning side because I had a smartphone. But this doesn't sound like winning. This sounds very stupid, in fact. The reason is, of course, what to it. And we want that link to be the right kind of link. And suddenly we're in a very deep philosophical mess. So this doesn't seem very likely to work a priori. But there is something else that actually looked a bit promising. If I'm linked to an AGI system and it can observe my evaluations of situations, it can actually estimate a bit what I would have done. So if it's trying to do what I would have done
Mhm.
instead, this actually gives it a good chance. So the system might
But you
notice
know
that,
where that's going, right?
yeah, yeah. The big
Okay.
problem is, of
Yeah,
course,
once it can predict everything you're doing, it has an emulation of your brain, right?
well, not necessarily. It might predict my value system, but nothing else. So the naive version of it might, for example, notice that I like helping little old ladies cross the street. And I don't think kicking them in front of a car is a good thing. Now,
Mm.
if it's just optimizing for that, then it might, for example, run away from little old ladies because it wants to avoid them, avoid helping them, etc. You need more rich information. And this is where things get interesting. If it could just get an entire copy of my brain, then we could definitely get the information over. But even my value system contains some useful things to do value alignment. So, for
Hmm.
example, if you follow up the causal reason, why do I like little old ladies crossing the street safely? Why do I dislike kicking people in front of cars? Now you might learn something about at least my morality that's actually quite useful. There are two things here, of course. Maybe one shouldn't just use my mind, because I'm definitely morally pretty flawed. Maybe we actually want to make sure that either we take a certified saint, or perhaps even better, have a lot of different people who might give input in order to do general value alignment. And second, of course, it's slightly tricky to get this to work really well, because neural interfaces are tricky. But if I'm just saying, no, robot, don't do that, or if I smile at the robot, that's already sending a signal. Maybe I don't need the neural interface at all. The neural interface is just cool because it might access my orbitofrontal cortex and give some actual evaluation information, even if I can't express it.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, these are all very good comments. And I like that you said, okay, just even if you don't think about emulation, if we're just talking about something earlier, like being able to understand your values, your value parameters, that can be helpful. And of course, I immediately started thinking about the deep learning networks that learn to be racist because they were learning from us. Um, and yeah, that's where you get into that whole value alignment issue and what are the right values and should you even care about the right values? Are you supposed to tinker with that when you're dealing with a particular person, or is that invading your freedoms and stuff like that? It gets very complicated, but I also think people tend to jump straight to the assumption that we can talk about a system where you have a strong integration of the machine and the brain, where you have a connection that somehow is tying you very closely into what this machine is doing. And you mentioned the cell phone, and I think it's a perfect example for trying to think through what this actually means. Because when we say you have a high bandwidth connection between a brain and a computer, the computer still can operate at microseconds and even smaller timescales, whereas the neurons can't. So in this link, they're talking at different speeds, and that is very similar to what we're seeing with the cell phone and ourselves. The cell phone has a different language, not just a different speed, it has a completely different type of language. It's using a microprocessor, and we have a neural brain, and we work at a slower pace from neuron to neuron, although we have a lot of them. And we communicate in a very particular way with this cell phone. We can only, press buttons or swipe, that sort of thing. So there's this communication delay or communication constraint built on this. And then you can think about, okay, so how has working with these cell phones, how has that affected the development of cell phones? This is sort of an analog for how does it affect the development of AI and potential AI safety, right? Or how has working with the cell phones affected us? Now, we can say a lot about how it's affected us, and some people think there are some good things there and some bad things there, probably a mix. But it also clearly has affected how cell phones are developed, because cell phones are always developed to try to fit into, say, these communication limitations, to work well with how we interact as interface development, to present information to us in a certain way that makes it easily graspable. We want interfaces that can tell us quickly what we're looking for, but of course that also constrains some features, right? The interfaces that are simple and fast are not interfaces that are highly configurable and very adaptable and all that. So we've got trade-offs, and this clearly has an effect. I think it's a great example, and I think maybe thinking more about how we already interact with machines in that way is a way to try to imagine what this would do, building a better or faster or wider interface with machines in some sense.
So ideally, of course, if you want an interface, it should be plug and play. It should work straight away. The problem is that probably means that it needs to be very pared down. And if you look at the general design philosophy coming out of Apple, it has always been actually cut away possibilities and just leave the things that people actually will want to do. Hide as much below the hood, or maybe even make the hood closed. You can't actually get onto it. Meanwhile, of course, if you're using any of Linux or Unix systems, everything is accessible, but, well, reading the manual and learning how to use it is getting very complicated. Once you know it, it's very powerful, but that takes a long time, and most people don't want to do that. So it might be that the transformative neural interfaces would be the ones that actually require a lot of learning. So the most fascinating neural interface I know of is, of course, Miguel Nicoleli's attempts at brain nets, connect brains to the other brains. And as a test of his idea, it seems like if this works, I want to see independent replication of it, but it looks like the brains can adapt to each other and learn how to decode each other's signals somehow. That's awesome if it's correct, but it also seems to take a lot of time. And I don't want to have a system that's not working for months and months, but yet I need to train myself to use it. So it might very well be that the neural interfaces we get at first, they're going to be useful for people who are desperately in need of it and strongly motivated, and the people who got the mindset to train themselves. But most applications are probably not going to be that deep. So instead, what you want to do is something that interprets enough of our signals and use a lot of smarts from the outside to try to figure out what we meant. And the fact that our minds are relatively slow compared to the machines is not necessarily a bad thing. It might be that we have a slow process initiating fast processes. And as long as we get enough feedback in our own pace, we can actually control that. This is a bit like how a constitution governs a state. The constitution is not changing that much. It's not supposed to be updatable at a very high pace. Below that level, you have the laws which are updated at a faster pace, while local regulation and norms can be updated faster and faster. So you might have systems with different levels of flexibility linked together. And if it's actually working well, then you can have a slow system setting the agenda, the fast systems implementing it, and some feedback system checking that everything is working. In practice,
this is really,
of course,
sorry, I hate to interrupt, but
practice,
I just want to say something right there because, before you were talking about the degree to which someone could say that they are a part, they're winning, they're part of the winning side, they're part of the whole thing if they're integrated, if they're connected with machines. Now we're talking about a slow system and a fast system, and that the slow system is somehow still governing and supervising what's going on. And it's interesting to compare that with what's going on in the brain already, where, for instance, we have systems that are slower. Our conscious awareness is definitely something that progresses at a different pace and in different chunks than all of that subconscious processing that's going on in parallel throughout our cortex. And similarly, when we're trying to think something through logically and we're trying to make up the steps, that's a very different and slower process than the other one. And that, in fact, is the process that the machines can do very quickly. So it'd be interesting to see what happens there. But it's interesting to then look at how integrated those really are and what's really going on there. So, for instance, we tend to think that our conscious awareness, that our conscious self is in control. We tend to think that that's the part that is really the boss, and we're governing everything that's going on. And yet, you can show experimentally that you have already decided something long before you know that you've decided something, because those subcortical processes are really doing that deciding work. Of course, this makes sense, right? And the rest is just a reflection to yourself. It's just an observation about what's been going on in your brain. And now we can imagine that something similar is the case if you integrate a human brain with the machines, who are operating at a completely different speed. They live in a world of nanoseconds that we can't live in. They live in a world where they can use things like, quantum computers or simulated annealing or something like that to come up with ideas and solutions that we can't think of in our brain. it seems like one of those situations where ultimately you may have a feeling, a sense of control without actually having it.
Yeah. So I think this is a very important point. And generally, I think most people say, yeah, I want to avoid that. There is an interesting debate going on actually among philosophers of mind and neuroscientists of a similar philosophical bent on is an illusion or not. And my impression of the current state of play is that a fair number of the things we're doing are indeed illusionary. But our top level consciousness and mind can give a veto and intervene, not very quickly, but we can
Can it
actually
really
use
give
the
a
top.
veto, or is it other drives that are informing your consciousness to then give the veto?
That is another good philosophical question. I need to check what the philosophers are saying about that. But I do think it makes sense that you have a top level that is actually getting information from most of our systems. The systems I really have a problem with is the ones that never have an output on the conscious level or never tell the rest of the systems what they're doing. The real kind of secret societies of the brain. I don't know how many they are or whether they play an important role. In general, the brain seems to have connected everything a little bit to everything else. It's just that the degree of control and the degree of information is not as intense as one would expect. Once you
Yeah.
start realizing how diffusely connected our different parts of our mind are, you start to feeling a bit like a cloud rather than a person.
Yeah, the illusion of control and whether or not that's a bad thing that there's an illusion of control, that's really, I think, is core to many of these questions that we're talking about today. Because when we first started talking, we talked about AI risk, and we talked a little bit about what do we imagine that a worst case scenario and a best case scenario is. Now, most of the time, people tend to think that the worst case scenario has something to do with a situation where humans are completely not in control and where they have no say over their future, and perhaps they're even somehow eliminated. Now, when we're talking about situations where control is mostly an illusion, but there are aspects of it where we're tied in, say there's this veto power that, again, perhaps isn't real because, free will as such may not exist at all, but but there's still something that we value. So really, when you talk about the danger of AI and what it can do to humanity, we should be talking about what are the values that we're trying to preserve? What would we call a successful outcome?
Yeah.
Which bits do we want to preserve and why? And then what sort of scenarios can incorporate that? And some scenarios may include a lot of change, where a lot of things that machines will be able to do and where they develop into becomes a part of what human society is, right?
Mhm. So I'm reminded of some of I.N.M. Banks' culture novels where very super intelligent machines play a role in the plot. And in many cases, they manipulate protagonists in various ways, more or less subtly. And the interesting thing is that in many ways, these manipulations can be, in many cases, they are fairly benign. Because they're still respecting the protagonist can do differently, but he's unlikely to want to do it differently because it's a really good argument and the situation is contrived in a certain way. Would we say that this is a bad situation? Well, as long as it's actually a fairly well-intentioned entity that actually has our own best interest and some other good goals, taking that into account, that might be all right. If I have a veto power but never exert it, I might still be pretty happy about that because I might have my illusion of control, but it still is important for me to function. Normally, we won't have a sense of control because we're agents. We survive by moving around on Earth's surface and manipulating things. And when we can't act, we're super vulnerable. When we're in a situation where action is not possible, we're at the mercy of everything else. And that evolution has made us really desire to be the actor.
Hmm.
Now, intellectually, we might sometimes realize that I should listen to a smarter person and do what he or she tells me because they actually know better. But my little inner 2-year-old will say, no, I will do the opposite just because. Then, of course, my inner 20-year-old will try to get the 2-year-old to listen to reason, and there is a lot of debate. And meanwhile, of course, maybe a really smart person will manipulate me because they know I have this internal dialogue. But a good outcome would be that you think that intentions are transparent enough that we can kind of see that these seem to point towards a future that is desirable.
Oh gosh, you just opened up a whole new can of worms.
It's
What
my
do we
fault.
find good and desirable? I just wanted to point out that you now have also again come across something that Jan Tallinn mentioned. He mentioned that he felt that a good future is one with as much optionality as possible, which of course is our desire for control. It's the desiring to have as many different paths as we can take as possible. But you mentioned that sense, the illusion of control, possibly being important to us, and then I was reminded of how many people say that what they desire is happiness, and then when we think of a future with happiness, then you get into these wireheading ideas, where you can just make someone feel happy, even if there's really nothing that's changed about their situation. And in the same way, it could be possible that we could give ourselves the illusion of control when we have zero control. So again, it doesn't immediately solve anything, but if we think through what the real, say, the values that we're trying to preserve are, you have to think about very basic things like the value of, say, something that we consider really human continuing for some reason because we think that very human thing is important or has made the universe a better place than it was without humans in it. Yeah, this gets really deeply philosophical, of course.
So it comes up in a lot of existential risk research too, because maybe if we nuke ourselves and the cockroaches become intelligent, maybe they will have a much better civilization by all accounts than us. In that case, maybe we should say, oh, that was a happy ending for the universe. And of course, some value theories would say, yeah, just integrate the total amount of happiness and compare that one. Now, others would say, wait a minute, how certain are we that happiness is what should be maximized? There might be other things. There might be deep thinking or paper clips or what have you. So we also have to take moral uncertainty into account. The nature of what is good about humans, our uniqueness, I think many people have an intuition about it. So there is a lot of things one can do here. And right now, I don't think we have any complete theory about what the good is. Obviously, philosophers have been working on this for a few thousand years, and progress has been modest. I think we have learned important things, but it's pretty clear that the list of things that could be the ultimate good, or the list of arguments why then maybe this list will never be complete, are pretty wide. But it's worth noticing that even if you take something as simple as happiness, people are quite bad at identifying what makes them happy.
Mm-hmm.
And even when they know this action would make me happy, they might quite often not take that one. So there is one of the scariest papers I ever read in Trends in Cognitive Sciences from a few years back, which is just reviewing these results. And to me, somebody who's kind of politically libertarian, this was horrifying. Because if people don't even do what makes them happy themselves, giving them the option of doing that, okay, now that doesn't necessarily work out very well. Now, I still think that most forms of control actually have very bad effects too. But it shows that it's tricky. Our feelings of what makes life better might not correspond to actually making life better, partially because our feelings are evolved things that made sense of the African savannah, and actually the life we're living now, not to mention in the future, might be so radically different that we need to develop new kinds of feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So we went down a really deep rabbit hole there for a moment, and I don't want this to go on for too long, but I'd still like to quickly touch on a few remaining questions about whole brain emulation in AI. So I wanted to talk about the idea that whole brain emulation itself can be a danger to humanity, and so I don't know exactly what people mean by that when they say it, but I think
I can
sometimes.
give some
Sure.
ideas. So I wrote a paper a few years back together with Peter Eckersley, who back then was at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, now is at the Partnership for AI. So we were looking at, could you get risk out of having brain emulation? And I think the most primary one would be, if you have software people, you suddenly have a radical break with a lot of traditional views on human nature. You would have some people who actually have religious reasons to say these are not true people. They would have potentially economically disruptive effects. If we look at all the ideas in Robin Hanson's The Age of M, that it seems like getting a brain emulation breakthrough might be dramatically disruptive, and you get entities that are in some sense a natural other. So you can very easily tell the story how you could get just a conflict where some people think brain emulated people are not people and they're evil and taking our jobs and so on. So you could get a very natural conflict. That's still, I think, not an argument against doing brain emulation, but rather making sure let's reduce bigotry and improve tolerance. But you could also, of course, have the idea that if you get a brain emulation, it's going to be self-improving so fast that now you get some form of hard takeoff. And before you know it, you have all the problems of the normal hard takeoff scenario in AGI.
Well, how do you see that possibility, by the way? How does a whole brain emulation do a fast takeoff?
I personally don't believe this is particularly likely. So the normal way of arguing it would be something like, well, it's running on a very fast computer. The emulated person can do a lot of neuroscience experiments on her brain. You can run a lot of copies, test out things to improve various capabilities. And before you know it, you have some kind of post-human who might now really start doing weird things depending on their value system. I'm not too worried about the person doing this. But you could imagine a society. So at some point, I think it was Carl Schulman who was arguing with Robin Hanson that, well, that brain emulation society he's describing in great vividness in his book, it's not going to last forever because people are going to update and compete and change it to other things. So in real time, it's not going to last very long. And they kind of agreed that maybe 2 weeks. That's still enough for a lot of history, enough for a book.
Yeah, we don't have to get into that necessarily. I think Robin's book is beautiful, but I think it has, as a prediction for things that will happen, it has its limitations. For instance, because he left out AI as being a part of it. So many of the things that he has whole brain emulations doing, are things that just a simple AI program could be doing, and that changes a lot about that whole scenario.
And you can imagine that they develop these simple AI sooner or later in the brain emulated world, and suddenly you get an economic transformation that might be just as disruptive for the emulated people as the biological people. So that scenario would rather be that you get very rapid cultural evolution, which might produce actually extremely different kinds of entities. Some people again would say, yeah, maybe we're going to be so weird post-human that we don't care about us meet humans, and that naturally leads to conflict. I think a more plausible risk is, yeah, this unleashes dramatic changes in a domain that a lot of people will not have access to and will be too slow to react to, and that might at the very least look like existential risk. And it might indeed be some form of existential risk if it develops into something that lacks those values that are really humane.
This gets us back to the same problem again, which is what is existential risk? What do we call a bad outcome for humanity? So let's say that whole brain emulation leads to a new Cambrian explosion of different kinds of minds who develop themselves in various different ways, not just minds, but bodies as well, etc. And some of them do better than others, so there's an evolutionary aspect to it. And you can see change happening in a way that's a bit faster than it is today. And when I say a bit, I might just be understating that. But, if that happens, the question still remains, is that bad? Because maybe this is the best possible outcome for whatever we consider valuable about humanity, because it's going to spread everywhere very quickly, even if it changes. So does speed matter? Does it matter if you go from A to Z by going A, B, C, D, all the way to Z and doing that in steps? Or is it just as good to jump from A to Z right away if the outcome is exactly the same? If, let's say, just as an argument for just the question of does the speed of change matter? Is it important that that rate is slow for some reason?
At least in the case of a personal identity, people typically think that the speed does matter. If I change day by day to become a more mature person with different political views, etc., okay, I might be fine with that, but not that one day I wake up and my personality and political views have changed instantly. Now, it seems philosophically that there's something problematic going on here, because I agree with you. Why should we care about those steps? And part of that is, of course, error correction. We might want to be able to go back or notice things. There should be time to realize what am I becoming? Oh dear, I know what I was voting for. I should totally change myself. But I think there is something interesting about that Cambrian explosion situation. To me, that sounds lovely. I think it would be great to have this open-ended future where you get a lot of humanities. And they are all drawing, of course, on originating from the same original species and might retain different aspects of us. However, you can also make a very scary scenario where various things that we care about evolve away. Nick Bostrom has this very disturbing paper about some post-human futures that are essentially devoid of value. So in one of them, the mindless outsourcers, basically people exist in an uploaded form and are outsourcing more and more of their brains. And in the end, there are no minds anymore. It's just an economy growing endlessly, but there's nobody at home. So the interesting thing here is, where does the value come from? And this is, of course, again, the deep rabbit hole, but I think it's worth recognizing that rabbit hole and kind of orbit around it at a safe distance. Part of that, as we normally do, we think, oh, being conscious and sentient seems to matter. Probably if consciousness is lost, then we're probably lost a lot of value. I'm willing to argue that maybe that's not all there is. Maybe there are unconscious systems that are valuable lives too, but that gets me into a big argument in the philosophy department. We can also say that some of our human nature might be valuable just because it is our human nature. We might not care about some famous paintings in a museum, but they're famous paintings that we should preserve because they're part of our past. Just as well as some of the horrors of our historical past, we should never forget about them. Not just because we want to learn not to do it again, but even that we think that if we were to forget about it, all the people who died in that particular horror would in some sense have lost something. There is a fair bit of interesting arguments in philosophy about this. There is a book here by Samuel Scheffler, Why Worry About Future Generations, which I found very fun because he's taking a non-consequentialist view about why we should care about humanity's future. And I find that really weird because I'm typically just thinking about what are the consequences. And he points out that you can actually love humanity. You can actually say there are things about humanity and its nature that we love, warts and all. And we want this to go on. So I think there's going to be a thick bundle in that black hole of what really makes life worth living that matters. And it might be that we need to hedge our bets. We don't really know whether it is our humanness or consciousness or the fact that we originated on this planet or just that we experience happiness. Maybe we won't have it all. We want that Cambrian explosion because it gives us a good chance of having it. I'd rather have a future that has both brain emulation people and biological people as an existential risk backup. If it was just one of them, I think we would actually both be in bigger risk and we might have missed out on the true values. It might turn out that just like consciousness might have added a profound new value to the entire universe, there might be the next step. Let's call it consciousness prime, which is even more important. It's unfortunate that no kind of matter in the current universe got it. You need to be maybe a brain emulation, a quantum computer, or whatever to actually start experience this value. And then the entities on the other side are going to say, yeah, and back then, of course, those poor Precambrian humans,
they didn't have this thing. Yeah,
they didn't
and it might not even
morally,
be. It might not even be something like, the next level of consciousness. It could be something completely separate from that, say something that we also think is super valuable but has nothing to do with consciousness.
Yeah. But to some degree, expanding the circle to encompass bigger and bigger sets seemed to be a good idea. So one of my common analyses point out apes. They might say, well, given the capabilities of those post apes, they call them humans, they could get a lot of bananas. And the apes would say, yeah, that's great. Bananas are good. And indeed, we are really good at getting bananas. We can get more bananas than any ape could imagine by planting them and doing everything. It's just that we're getting constantly sidetracked from the pursuit of bananas and sex by also doing philosophy and technology and politics and art and sports. And we would try to say to these apes, well, actually, you don't know what you're missing out on, actually. Science is pretty awesome. And post-humans or these quantum consciousness prime whatevers, they might say, oh yes, the philosophy and science, they're so cute and very nice part of life. We of course got these other things that you can't even imagine. But occasionally we do like our bananas. The thing is, if we retain some cores, and they might be somewhat silly things like bananas, that might also be a continuity that means that we care about the long-term future. I think one of the big fears people have is that you get this disruption. There is humans and post-humans, and there is no similarity whatsoever. This is part of the fear we have of AGI, because we might make something that's utterly dissimilar from us, and we actually don't have any way of telling them about what values we have and aligning them. When it comes to brain emulation, I always felt that we're much closer. We're at least starting out very similar. Then it might go off in different directions, but I think we have a good start.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, whether or not someone has thought through all these details, that's kind of where very often the discussion ends up going as well. At least if we start with whole brain emulation, we know that whatever you've got there begins with something that is very human. And so whatever these values are that we care about, they're probably contained in there somewhere. Although it'd be great if we can explore the value thing. It's, not right now, but if that gets explored further, and I don't know, we can't make a prediction here. Are we going to solve the problem of what are the values we want to preserve in 5 years, 10 years? Where's our deadline here,
Yeah. So in some
Yeah.
sense, doing philosophy with a deadline, I think that's a new thing that Nick Bostrom introduced. And I think it's important to realize that there are some deep philosophical problems that maybe we can't solve, but I think we should try to do practical progress on handling them, because they're actually becoming action relevant. And in some cases, that progress might just be, okay, we need to do more hedging because we will not figure it out before the time is up. But moral trade and moral hedging are possible things, and they can be quite powerful.
Indeed. So I've kept you on this now for quite a long time, so it's probably time for me to sort of bring it to a close. But before we do, and I have a concluding question for you, but even before I ask that concluding question, I wanted to know if you think that there is something important or relevant that we haven't touched upon, haven't covered, that you think should be mentioned here.
I think the core issue I have is we have been talking about many things that have been around our community for a long while. Some of it we have written a bit of papers about, but it's very little. I think there is more work to be done here. Some of that might be done by neuroscientists or philosophers. I think there is quite a lot of room for interesting joint work here, trying to turn this a little bit more rigorous. Maybe measure what is the flow of ideas between different sciences. That's interesting on its own. You can make a good academic paper out of it, but it might also tell us a little bit about the safety issues. I think we need to work a lot more on what can we do safety for neuromorphic computing. Right now, a lot of safety work tends to assume these platonic computers running on little black boxes on whiteboards, and that might be good to prove some things about, but we might want to figure out other ways of doing AI safety and machine safety.
Yeah. And
So we have plenty of things to work on here.
all these questions about values and what values we're trying to preserve, and therefore what a good outcome is, that's really part of that, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of that, of course, is traditional philosophy. There is even a branch of ethics, axiology, the philosophy of value itself. But I think also we have found that there are values here.
Sorry.
The orbitofrontal cortex does have value representations, and we're actually figuring out non-trivial things, both from addiction research and scanning of brains when we make choices, about how we do evaluations and how it functions. I think there is a lot of room to do empirical research here that might actually give a good kick to the traditional philosophy to see it in new ways. I think we have seen a rekindling of interest in ethics in many parts of philosophy because of AI safety research. Because it actually forces philosophers to try to formulate, can I make my ethical system something that could run on a computer? And most traditional systems are absolutely impossible and too fussy and badly defined, or have too big computational demands. And then we can start asking, so what is a moral system that actually can run on a brain or a computer? And what is the philosophical import of that?
Mm-hmm. So you do think that at some point we will have answers to all these questions, or do you think it's just going to be a situation where we become progressively more aware of what all the detailed questions are, and we just kind of lay out all the questions and we sort of swim in them?
Well, philosophy is interesting because many sciences try to advance, we try to move forward, and philosophy tends to try to dig deeper instead. And sometimes that's the right choice, but in many practical cases, we want to move forward. I'm writing a book about the long-term future, and I actually, right now, I have a very loose calculation. Given that we haven't solved these problems yet, what's the likely time until philosophy solves them if we believe there is a Pareto distribution of problem difficulty? And I ended up with something like maybe it's going to take 10 to 20 philosopher years before we figure out what it's all about.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Okay.
Might be faster if we have better computers, but it might turn out that actually it's going to be far in the future when finally some super post-human kind of goes, oh, that's kind of obvious.
Isn't it interesting how The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy already predicted this?
Yep.
42. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it made a very good point. You need to understand the question really well. Then the answer is typically quite easy. So one of the interesting things about this interplay between philosophy and science and practical engineering is that quite a lot of time you get these practical issues that force you to refine your deep philosophical question. I think we're going to find eventually that axiology probably gets solved because we actually do a lot of neuroscience, and then that forces philosophers to think in a different way.
Okay, awesome. So concluding this, my last question, what do you think that, I mean, this is again an impossibly complex question, but what do you think that humanity should be doing, or how should it change how it approaches problems compared with what we're doing today to maximize our long-term chances for both survival and thriving as a society?
So I do think we need to find ways of aiming at an open-ended future, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything is possible. We might want to cut off disastrous possibilities. We want to avoid existential risk. And in order to do that, we probably need better tools for insight and coordination. So right now, it might seem that we're in this world of fake news and international chaos. We're doing really badly about it. But compared to a century ago or 2 centuries ago, the United Nations is a really hopeless organization. But 2 centuries ago, it was unthinkable. What? Getting all nations together without weapons and actually agreeing on at least a few things? In 200 years, we might actually be able to do something much better. Similarly, yeah, we have a lot of problem with fake news, but we also got things like Wikipedia, which is kind of an early stab at creating a common knowledge base. Again, that was the first stab, and it's probably not going to be the last or best. So I do think that we can work quite hard on improving this insight and coordination things. Better filtering mechanisms of separating true and false information, which includes, of course, science. The replication crisis in especially psychology demonstrates that we need to work quite a bit on building a better engine of scientific knowledge. But even the problems we have when we data mine the scientific papers and try to run that to do medical diagnosis turns out into trouble because many papers are so bad. We need better ways of doing this. And those tools are useful in a lot of domains. We might want to have a better chance of tracking our own truth. We might want to find ways of having discourses that work better. It's a gradual thing, and there's going to be an uphill struggle to get there. Similarly, the coordination. In the long run, we need to coordinate before we start scattering across the universe and become too incomprehensible for each other and too far causally removed. Before that, we might actually need to have a big meeting and decide, okay, this is what we're going to do long term with the universe. This is how we're going to hedge our moral bets. This is how we're going to move the galaxies and making sure that it stays in the right way.
Is that a meeting the FHI is going to have in 2021?
Let's hope for something like that. So actually, the original idea is Will MacAskill's idea. He talks about the long reflection, that maybe once we got in our act together, we should just sit down as a species and maybe spend 1,000 years debating what to do just to get it really right. And right now, this sounds absurdly utopian. This sounds totally crazy. But then again, so did the United Nations once upon a time. So we should start working on making the tools, to make the tools, to make the tools, to make good insights and good decision making. And of course, making sure that we don't go extinct while doing this. We should never let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Oh, that can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
On a more personal note, given all of the things we just talked about, and there's so much more, of course, how do you deal with the fact that this is such an overwhelming pile of stuff? I mean, how do you tackle that, or just like go at it and still feel that there is good purpose in moving forward every day?
So the problem is not finding purpose because there's so many interesting and important things to work on. It's rather, how do I choose the most important thing and focus on it? And I'm lousy at that. I'm basically an academic magpie. I see something shiny and I go for it. So over the past 1.5 years, I've been somewhat focused because I've been working on my book about what I call grand futures. And it's broad enough that it actually allows me to, whenever I get distracted, I just write another part of a book. That is one way of doing it. I have colleagues who are way more focused. They sit down and they think very carefully about what matters, spend even more time checking that it really matters, and then they start working on it. And I think we can, again, like hedging bets, you hedge yourself by having people with different strategies. And then sometimes we compare notes and see, oh, that seems to be something I should be doing.
Okay, that's really good advice. Yeah, there's some different strategies there.
Mm.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very
That's
much. This was
exciting.
a fantastic conversation, I have to say. Yeah, like always.
Well, we should keep it up and make sure that the future continues to have great conversations until the end of time.
Oh, yeah. And you'll be welcome back at the Carbon Copies Foundation again and again for sure.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Yeah.
Okay, stop the
Yeah.
recording now.
Cheers.